Hello, year 10. It's Miss Taplin and I'll be taking your lesson today. We are going to look at the poem Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. And this is from your Power and Conflict section of the anthology. So our key question today is, how is conflict presented in Bayonet Charge? You're going to answer that by understanding and responding to the text, discussing context, and understanding language and structure. So a bit of information then about Ted Hughes, some contextual information. I'm going to read it through and then I'd like you to pause the video and summarise this information into 5 bullet points. So Ted Hughes was born near Halifax, West Yorkshire in 1930. His father was a carpenter and a veteran of World War I. Although his family moved when he was 8 years old, the landscape of his birth had a huge impact on his writing. He went to Cambridge in the 1950s, where he read English literature, archaeology and anthropology. While at Cambridge, he met his first wife, Sylvia Plath, whom he married in 1956. It's worth noting here that Sylvia Plath in herself is a very famous author and poet. After university, he had various jobs, including working in a zoo, teaching and reading scripts at Pinewood Studios. Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes had 2 children, but later separated. In the year after their separation, she committed suicide. Hughes followed his relationship with Plath by one with Asia Wevel. They lived together and she looked after his children from his first marriage. However, she also committed suicide, gassing herself and her daughter in a manner similar to that of Plath. Hughes writes about the elements and aspects of the natural world in much of his poetry. The poet Simon Armitage said that for Hughes, poetry was a connecting rod between nature and humanity. This poem seems to be heavily influenced by the fact that Hughes's father was a veteran of the First World War, having survived his regiment's massacre at Gallipoli, as well as by the poetry of Wilfred Owen. Ted Hughes served in the RAF, but he did not see combat. He spent much of his time in the services reading. Okay, I don't want you to spend any more than 5 minutes doing your summaries, please. Just 5 bullet points to summarise this information. So, before we read the poem, we're going to have a look at a bit more context for this poem. So we're going to watch 2 clips on YouTube, which are dramatisations of what's called going over the top. So this is a term that refers to the moment when soldiers left the trenches during World War I in order to try and gain more ground. The first clip is from War Horse and the second clip is from a TV film, I think, called My Boy Jack. I'll be sending out a copy of this PowerPoint so you'll be able to access those links. When you finish watching them, your task, no more than 10 minutes for this, I want you to think about what you've seen. I want you to create a mind map of the emotions and thoughts of the soldiers as they are about to go over the top. What will be running through their minds? Why will they have joined the army? Will they be thinking of that, do you think, when they go over the top? How about when they make it over the top, sort of how will their emotions change? And I'd like you to add some sensory descriptions as well. What will they be feeling, seeing? What will the sounds be like? What will they be able to smell? So, no more than 10 minutes doing that. Okay, so now we're going to go through some vocabulary in the poem that you might not be familiar with. I think quite a lot of these you'll already know, but just in case. So we've got bayonet, clod, patriotic, bewilderment, statuary, furrows, threshing. Okay, so a bayonet is kind of rifle and it's got a blade on the end so that in close quarter fighting you can stab the opposition. You've got clod, which refers to like a lump of earth. Patriotic is a really, really important word in this poem. So this refers to those feelings of loyalty that you have to your country, those feelings of pride that you have of your history and things like that. Patriotism can also go too far, where you get to the point where you don't respect other cultures or traditions because you feel like yours is the only sort of important one. So it's really important that we're careful when we're talking about patriotism. Bewilderment, that face sort of sums it up. It's that feeling of being confused or puzzled. Statuary refers to statues. Furrows are those sort of lines in the earth when a farmer's ploughed the fields. And then we've got threshing, which is when a farmer chops down those crops. And it sort of, if you look at the picture, you can see somebody doing it by hand there. Okay. So we're going to do our first read through of the poem. I'm going to read it. I'd like you, when I've finished reading it, I'd like you to have your hard copies in front of you. I want you to pause the video and I want you to have a read through afterwards as well. Bayonet charge. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw, in raw-seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye sweating like molten lime from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment, then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet towards the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terrors touchy dynamite. So your next task is about your first impressions of the poem. This is a really quick task that I want you to spend no more than 5 minutes on. I want you to think about who is the focus of the poem, and then in no more than 3 sentences I want you to briefly summarise what each stanza is about. I don't want you to panic about this. Some of you are going to think, God, I don't even know what that's about. Don't worry about that. Just give me your first impressions, okay? There's no real wrong answers to this. It's just what you've understood so far. For the next 3 slides, we're going to look at the poem stanza by stanza. And on each slide, there are several boxes with some tasks on, questions, little explanations and things like that I want you to add to your copy of the poem. Obviously, you've got to answer the questions. I'm not going to go through them all, but I will pick out 1 or 2 to talk about. And towards the end of the video, I've got 3 quotes that I want to go through in more detail. Okay. So looking at stanza 1, these are all the boxes that I want you to work through. You can highlight your copy, you can write on it, anything you want. So we'll look at this idea of media res in this top corner here, and this means that it opens in the middle of things, so we're thrown straight into the action. Okay, our focus is on this soldier in World War I, and he has just gone over the top. Okay, there's some tasks about language here, so you're looking at violent words and thinking about their effects. There's an interesting question: why mention the hedge is green? Considering the effects of the war, what is the significance of this green hedge? And remember, Hughes is really interested in nature, he's passionate about nature. So if we think about that green hedge, it's almost a symbol of hope, isn't it? It's survived so far in this horrible war. So you could think of it as some sort of symbol. It could have other meanings too, but that's for you to look into. Okay, it's got an irregular rhythm, it's in free verse, there's no set rhyme, there's no meter, so it is very chaotic. There's no control in this poem, which you could say reflects the action on the battlefield. And patriotism is a very key idea in this poem. It's what drove these young men to sign up. However, Hughes gives the impression that it's somewhat misguided and useless, and that's something we'll look at throughout the poem. Okay. So at this point you need to stop the video and you need to work through those boxes. Okay, so there's a couple of key terms that I need to run through with you, just in case you've forgotten what they mean. Okay, so we've got enjambment here, and that refers to these sentences that just run on with no punctuation at the end there, and you need to think about the structure there, and try reading through those, and you'll find that it's quite difficult. You have to take quite a deep breath, and it feels like you're going to run out of breath as well. So we could say that maybe reflects the soldier as he's running and sort of gasping for air. Okay, we've got a caesura here. A caesura is when you've got a stop in the middle of a line of poetry there. Okay, so why does it stop there? What's this soldier doing? Okay, the key metaphor regarding stars and nations is going to be one of those key quotes that we look at in more detail, and I'll leave you to run through this idea of statuary, this idea that a sculptor designs and controls the statue, and it's almost like this soldier is like that. He's being controlled, isn't he? So again, pause the video here and work through these ideas. Don't forget, this is a really famous poem, so there is tons of information online about this. If there's anything you don't understand or you want to check, I would definitely encourage you to do a bit of independent work there. And then finally, the final stanza. Okay, so we've got that verb threshing, and remember, it's that action of cutting those crops down. If we think about this yellow hair, this symbol of nature, thrashing around and sort of making a mess on the floor, and it's quite a shocking image, this idea of its mouth wide open, silent, its eyes standing out. And it makes me sort of wonder, is this a symbol of those soldiers that died in the gas attacks and things like that? And we've also got that idea of the war interfering with nature. Okay, so it could have several different meanings, and I'd like you to try and come up with some of your own here. Okay, I'd also like to talk about the idea of futility. When you say something is futile, it means it's pointless, it has no meaning. Okay, and a lot of poets, when they talk about war, talk about the futility of war, the idea that it doesn't really solve anything. Okay, we'll have a quick run through this last two lines here. To get out of that blue crackling air, his terrors touchy dynamite. So we could say that blue air could refer to the smoke in the air from the ammunition and things like that. The crackling could be fire, and that idea of his terrors touchy dynamite, and dynamite's explosive, so it's almost as though his terror is literally going to overwhelm him at some point. He's just about to sort of explode, metaphorically. Okay, so again, pause the video, work through these ideas, and don't forget to add your own ideas too. I'm not the be-all or end-all of this poem, and we always, when we study this in class, we come up with new ideas, and those come from the students, so it's very likely you will bring something else to this poem. Please feel free to add your own ideas. Okay, so for the next bit, these are my, we're going to work through 3 quotations that I've selected and that I've exploded. And I've done it on paper with coloured pens because I'm a bit nerdy and I like doing stuff like that. You can see there I've made a spelling error, so I've just covered it up because I can't have that on display. Okay, so the first quote, suddenly he awoke and was running raw seemed hot khaki. So I'm going to start with that adverb, suddenly. Okay, so we're in media res, we're in the centre of the action, it's exciting, and it's an explosive opening. It throws us straight in there. We've got elements of shock, surprise, and chaos. We've got that pronoun, he, so there's no name there. It's almost a universal soldier. He could be anyone, so it's almost like it's a shared and common experience. It could apply to any soldier. And we have to think, why has Hughes done that? Awoke, so that creates questions for me. Was he actually asleep, or was he just daydreaming or lost in thoughts? He immediately becomes alert, so we've got that juxtaposition, that comparison between resting and then running. There's no in-between state, and we have to ask ourselves why. What is that showing us about this soldier? Is it almost like he never gets any rest? He can't rest. Raw, it could refer to him being a new and inexperienced recruit. We sometimes hear new young soldiers being called raw recruits. Okay, this adds another layer of vulnerability to him. If he's sort of inexperienced, if he's young, we feel more sorry for him, don't we? And then we've got raw repeated again, but in this sort of phrase, raw seemed. So it's got a different meaning here. It could mean sore and painful. So his uniform causes him pain and discomfort. So that could be a metaphor for his experience in the war. That uniform could symbolise his place in the war, in the army, and the pain and discomfort that it brings him. We've got khaki, which, unless you didn't know, is the colour of the army uniform, and it's often used as a means of signifying the army. So if you reference that word khaki, we almost sort of instantly associate it with the army uniform. Okay, so you can see from that first quote that I've got quite a lot of ideas there, and doing it like this helps me certainly to develop those ideas and come up with new things. So my second quote is this. Yeah, I think this is a key quote in the poem, and it's well worth really looking into this one. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? So this is a key question that this soldier kind of asks himself, and it's like he's had a sudden epiphany. And an epiphany is when you have that light bulb moment. You've all sort of experienced that, I'm sure. It's when you just have that moment where everything seems very clear and you have this clear understanding of a situation. Okay, so I'll start from the beginning. We've got cold. It lacks emotion. There's no room for pity, kindness, or mercy. It almost shows these soldiers as being dehumanized. This idea of a clockwork, it's very intricate. We've got lots of cogs and gears, and people often talk about the war machine. Okay, it's this idea that it's this big, huge sort of organisation behind it. You've got your people at the top running things, and then you've got all those soldiers on the ground, and it's a very carefully organised structure. So this soldier has the realisation that he is a very, very, very tiny and insignificant part of this machine. He's almost anonymous and inconsequential. If he died in the war would just carry on regardless. Okay, he doesn't really matter in a way. The reference to the stars and nations perhaps relates to God and earth and the whole of creation, and sort of linked to that, for those of you going for those higher grades, there's possible religious connotations too. There's this idea of God's plan, and that what happens is inevitable. So this links also to this idea that he's part of this machine. He can't stop it. He's got no control. The next part was he the hand. Okay, so he's questioning his purpose and his reason for being there. He's had this sudden realization. He's on this battlefield. He's in amongst all this chaos. And all of a sudden, he's sort of questioning, why am I here? And then that final two words, it's that second. It suggests to me that the situation is constantly changing, and it creates this atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty. Everything is all over the place. And again, if you look here, I think the general sort of gist of this is that lack of control. This person has no control over what he's doing here. He's just a part of a machine. And then the final quote that I picked to explode was this one. So, king, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm. Okay, so there's that first triple there, king, honour, human dignity, is highly emotive and patriotic words in this this poem, and you often hear those words linked to people who say they're fighting for something. Okay, this is why men joined up in such numbers. These are the values that they wanted to protect or thought they would be protecting, and it has those connotations of nobility and bravery. They thought they were doing a noble and brave thing, which of course they were, but they got these high ideals in their minds, and maybe not really understanding what they were getting into. And on the end of that line is almost like this bomb, this etc. Okay, this simple final word has a massive impact, and it completely undermines that triple. Okay, it devalues those words, and it makes them worthless and meaningless. So you've got king, honour, human dignity, these amazing ideals, and then just etc. It's like they mean nothing. Okay, and then the simile, dropped like luxuries. It's the ideas of patriotism are a luxury. So it's all well and good thinking about king, honour and human dignity when you're sat at home, safe and sound, but they do nothing to protect you on the battlefield. They gloss over the actual real horrors of war. And then the final two words there, yelling alarm, we've got that sort of violence and brutality there, which signify the reality of war, which is fear, violence and chaos. There is no space for noble ideas here. It's just fear and that desire to stay alive. So I hope that by looking at these sort of explosions, you can see how you can take a quote and pull it to pieces and write down your ideas. It doesn't have to be neat. It's just you getting your ideas together. Okay. So your next task is you're going to do your own quote explosion. I want you to pick your own quote from the poem and have a go at exploding it. Add as many ideas as you can. Now I want you to be clever about this. Don't pick a quote that you have no idea about, because you're just going to sit twiddling your thumbs and feeling a bit rubbish because you can't do it. Pick a quote that you feel like you understand and go for it. Spend about 5 minutes on it. Okay, and of course you can use coloured pens like I did if you're a bit nerdy. So back to our key questions. So this is the bit where you're going to write an analytical response to our key question. How is conflict presented in Bayonet Charge? Okay, so when we're responding to a question, it's a good idea to have a really good think about what it's asking you to do and to be quite creative with how you respond to it. So this question asks you about conflict, and there's many different conflicts within this poem. You don't just have to talk about the war. So you've got the conflict between the natural world and mankind, the emotional and psychological conflict of the soldier. You've got the conflict between his commitment to patriotism, which is then replaced by fear. Okay. So what I want you to do is I want you to respond to this question. Okay, it's going to be an essay style response with 3 paragraphs, I think, and I've already given you 3 quotations that are pretty much analysed. You just have to expand it into a better paragraph. I'm going to set a limit. You can only use at the maximum 2 of those. I want one of your paragraphs to be from your own choice of quote, okay? And I want to see some of your own ideas in there as well, okay? So use mine if you want to use them, or go ahead and use all of your own, okay? So 3 paragraphs, no more than that, okay? You don't need to do any more than that. responding to that question, how is conflict presented in Bayonet charge? And then finally, I want you to go back to your first impressions, okay? So I want you to look back through what you thought the poem was about and what you know it's about now. Okay, if you're still feeling a little bit like you're unsure, then this is a point at which you need to go online and you need to do a bit more research. Okay, like I said, there is tons of information on there, which is very easily accessible. Okay,